Hi, I'm Augie Frost with the Oklahoman, and I'm here today with Don Hamilton, the Executive Director of the Memorial Institute for the Prevention of Terrorism. Don has a new publication out. It's called The Path to a Counterterrorism Doctrine. We're here to talk a little bit about that publication and just terrorism in general. So, Don, tell us a little bit about the publication.
Well, we've spent a lot of time here in the last 8 years. We started operations on the 5th anniversary of the bombing of the Murrah building. Looking at terrorism, looking at ways to counter it, and working on tools, both mechanical, physical tools, and intellectual tools to respond to terrorism. One of the key players in all of this is David Sid, the deputy director here. David wrote this essay on finding the doctrine for this. David worked for the FBI for over 20 years, and a lot of that time he spent on intelligence and counterterrorism matters. He has said, and I agree with him completely, that if you're going to start examining terrorism in the context in which we live it today and the doctrine and the policy we have about terrorism, you do not start with 9/11 and you don't start with Oklahoma City. A reasonable starting place, to the degree there is one, is in 1993 and the first bombing of the World Trade Center. Now that's an interesting story. You had Islamist radicals who were part of a group who came in and tried very hard to knock down the World Trade Center, and they kind of hoped that they would, by putting a van packed with explosives in the basement of one of those towers, cause it to topple into the other tower with much the same effect that we had on 9/11, but in fact with far, far more deaths because there wouldn't have been any warning or time to evacuate. Now, the FBI is the world's premier criminal investigative agency. Within almost no time, they got a great break. One of the terrorists was so dumb that he tried to get the deposit back on a van they had rented for the operation. Well, that quickly led to his identification, his associates, and before you know it, they had everyone directly and immediately involved in that under arrest, and they had a successful criminal prosecution. Close the books. That's it. I mean, that's what you do when you're in the law enforcement business. You find the guys who did it, you lock them up, and you gather your evidence, you get a trial, you put them in jail, throw away the key, and you're done. Except that approach, which is what David calls case-focused, and what I would say is law enforcement-focused, is that once the bad guys are in jail, the job's over and you wait for the next thing to happen. We now know, but we only learned it more than 8 years later when you had the attack on 9/11, that there was a thread that ran from the even earlier assassination of Rabbi Meir Kahane up through World Trade Center 1, World Trade Center 2, and all the rest of it with Al-Qaeda. So the new doctrine proposal that we have is that our counterterrorism doctrine needs to be intelligence-driven in great measure. We need to we need to be gathering and looking at information separately from the question of forming a case and prosecuting a crook. There's a difference between a bank robber and a terrorist, and we need to recognize that. And somehow we have to get the right balance between intelligence work, a law enforcement response, and, as needed, a military response. That's the gist of it, is we need to take all of our national tools and do that. And we need a national response, not a federal response. We need to find a way to take the observations of local police and fold them in to a way of collecting information. We're not talking about being more intrusive, just taking the scraps of information that the hundreds of thousands of cops who are on the streets every day can report anomalies that don't warrant by themselves the opening of a criminal investigation.
I get the feeling that this is not necessarily just law enforcement and government, but this could reach even down to the average individual.
In a way it could. I wouldn't like to see us form Cuban-style block warden systems in which you're invited to snitch out your neighbor for ideological impurity. But yes, we can do something with see something, say something. There's no harm, I think, in asking meter readers or postmen who, if they see certain kinds of indicators, to say something to someone, just as we invite with posters on subways and things, see something, say something. There's a chance it will help, and we shouldn't embarrass people who report something that looks fishy to them and turns out to be nothing. There's nothing wrong with that, but really the mechanism probably needs to be the police. They're rolling around on our streets every day. They are trained observers. They have a good idea of what's natural and normal for this place and time. And sometimes they're going to see things that aren't, but it's not something that they necessarily want to investigate as criminal activity or have any basis to.
Obviously, we're coming up on the anniversary of September 11th. So
of course.
Being that it's been that many years since the attack, what have we learned? What can we learn? Where are we at in fighting terrorism?
What we need to have learned is that having doctrines and responses programmed on what's happened before is necessary but not sufficient. Consider 9/11, if you will. We had a doctrine on airline hijackings. The assumption was the hijackers really took airplanes because it's a great way to get a bunch of hostages, and that they wanted the crew and passengers as hostages. That was the pattern of dozens, if not hundreds, of airline hijackings over the last 20, 30 years. In fact, the crews and passengers were an annoyance to the hijackers. They were a burden, and witness what happened in Pennsylvania with United Flight 93. In fact, they wanted the aircraft to use them as weapons. So we have to be open to that idea and not put ourselves on a pre-programmed automatic response to an incident. And one of the things that concerns me personally is that we are putting a lot of emphasis on aviation security and on preventing the big, giant terrorism spectacular. What if Al-Qaeda changes or some new group emerges that wants to replicate what the Washington sniper did a few years ago, where two misfits with a beat-up old car terrified Washington, D.C. for a while. I happened to be in Iraq working with the occupation government at the time of the Washington sniper events, and I had friends who were in Iraq saying they were worried about their families back home. We need to have a steady, constant, thoughtful response to terrorism, not a wave pattern. We had a lot of interest in terrorism in the 80s when a lot of bad things were happening, and it kind of drifted down and fell down. And now people are starting to say, 7 years since 9/11, no big attacks here at home, think we may be past this. No, we need a steady, thoughtful, wide-ranging approach that uses all the tools we have.
Does it worry you that we might be becoming comfortable, that we might...
Absolutely it does. And I don't want to, I'm not a scare people to death guy. I mean, the chances that you, your family, or anyone watching this show would be physically attacked by terrorists are pretty small. Now, the chances that the Murrah building were going to be blown up were fairly small. But it happens. And when it does happen, it changes our society. When I was a young man, I could walk onto an airplane with no more fanfare than I could walk onto a bus. No one, I mean, I had to give a name to get a reservation, but nobody checked to make sure it was my name. And they certainly didn't examine me for weapons, never mind make me take my shoes off and leave my shampoo at home. It changes the world we live in if we don't pay attention to these threats.